She vanished at 18, but she was never gone. Beneath the floorboards of her family home, behind a steel door and layers of silence, she lived in darkness for 24 years. No sunlight, no freedom, only the voice of the man who stole everything from her. This case is about a quiet suburban town in Austria, where one man buried a secret so deep it took nearly a quarter of a century to uncover. Josef Fritzl lived in Amstetten, a small town lined with modest homes, clipped hedges, and neatly paved streets. He was known as a stern man, a retired electrician with an intense gaze and a rigid posture. To most, he was just another aging father with a large family and a gray concrete house that never drew much attention. But underneath that house, behind a hidden doorway sealed with an electronic lock, lay a secret chamber that would haunt the world. His daughter Elizabeth disappeared in 1984 at the age of 18. The official story was that she ran away. Fritzl even handed police a letter that claimed she had joined a cult. It was enough to close the file. What no one knew was that Josef had spent years preparing for her vanishing. He built a windowless basement beneath his home. It was small, damp, and silent, filled with the hum of old ventilation fans and the staleness of recycled air. The walls were lined with concrete. There were no windows, no clocks, no way to mark time. The only light came from flickering bulbs he controlled. Inside that space, Elizabeth was held in complete isolation. Her days blurred into nights. Outside, life moved on. Children played on the streets. His wife cooked dinner upstairs. No one heard a sound. Over the next 24 years, Elizabeth endured unthinkable acts at the hands of the man who should have protected her. She gave birth to 7 children in that basement. 1 died shortly after birth. 3 lived with her in the dark. The others were taken upstairs and raised as foundlings, dropped at the doorstep with forged notes Fritzl claimed were written by Elizabeth. Neighbors noticed nothing. Authorities visited, but saw only what they were allowed to see. Even Fritzl's wife claimed to know nothing. What emerged in 2008 was not just a criminal case. It was a revelation of how far someone can go to maintain control, how silence can be weaponized, and how entire lives can be stolen without anyone noticing. The cellar beneath Josef Fritzl's house was not just a prison. It was a monument to secrecy, fear, and the failure to listen to the quietest voices. At first, the world above barely noticed her absence. Elizabeth had tried to run away before. She was quiet, withdrawn, often isolated within her strict household. When she vanished in 1984, Josef told police she had joined a religious group. He handed them a letter that appeared to be in her handwriting. It begged them not to search for her. Investigators accepted the explanation and closed the case. No one asked where the letter had come from. No one questioned how she had written it under duress. And no one thought to look beneath the very home they had searched. Beneath the family's suburban house, the air was cold and still. Josef had spent years preparing the basement, reinforcing walls with concrete and installing remote locks that only he could control. The only entrance was through a hidden passage behind a row of shelves in his private workshop. No one else had the key. The lights were dim, the ceiling low, the floor unforgiving. Elizabeth lived there with no natural light and no sense of time. The air smelled of damp cement and metal. The silence was heavy. When the door shut, it erased her from the world. Josef controlled every second. He regulated when she ate, when she could move, when she could speak. Over time, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child. There were no doctors, no pain relief, no clean instruments, only a mattress on the cold floor and the flickering light above her. The cries of a newborn filled the small space. She had to cut the cord herself, using nothing but scissors and a shoelace. The child survived. It would not be the last. In the years that followed, Elizabeth gave birth to 6 more children. One of them, a twin, died shortly after birth. Josef disposed of the body in the basement furnace. 3 of the children remained underground. They grew up never seeing the sun. Their world was made of concrete walls, dim lights, and the steady creak of pipes. Their voices were quiet. Their eyes struggled in daylight. They slept during the day and were awake at night. They whispered instead of speaking. Josef taught them to fear noise. The other 3 children were taken upstairs. Josef claimed they had been abandoned by Elizabeth at the doorstep. He He left forged notes written in her name, begging him to care for the babies. Social workers visited. One even congratulated the family on their generosity. Josef's wife believed her daughter had changed her mind and was sending the children home. No one questioned why a young woman on the run from society would keep sending babies back to the very household she had escaped. He presented himself as a dutiful grandfather and concerned father. Behind closed doors, he orchestrated complete control over 2 lives. Upstairs, he was respected. Downstairs, he was feared. He managed to maintain this double life for 24 years. The sounds in the basement were muffled. When it rained, the pounding of water on the roof drowned out their voices. When guests came over, the volume on the television was raised. Elizabeth and the children learned to stay quiet. Every attempt to cry out was met with silence or punishment. Over time, hope wore thin. The children made drawings of houses they had never seen. They imagined grass they had never touched. They dreamed of stars they could not name. Meanwhile, Josef was aging. His visits grew less frequent. Supplies would sometimes arrive late. Tension grew as the children became harder to manage. The space was never meant to hold so many lives. Mold crept along the walls. The air thickened. Still, there was no rescue. Still, no one asked the right questions. Then, in April 2008, the oldest underground child, Kirsten, collapsed. She was gravely ill. Her body was weak from years of poor nutrition and lack of sunlight. Her immune system had never been exposed to the outside world. Elizabeth begged Josef to take her to the hospital. At first, he refused. Then, realizing the risk of death, he agreed. But he warned Elizabeth to stay hidden. He brought the unconscious girl upstairs and left her at the hospital, claiming she was his granddaughter. Doctors were alarmed. Kirsten's condition was critical. Her symptoms made no medical sense. Authorities launched an inquiry. Something was wrong. The child had no birth certificate, no records, no history, and no one could explain where she had come from. Media coverage exploded. Josef returned to the hospital, but could not answer the questions. Days later, he allowed Elizabeth to emerge from the basement. She had one chance. She told the truth, every word. Police listened. They verified her identity and raided the house. Behind the shelves in Josef's workshop, they found the door. Behind the door, the corridor. Behind the corridor, a life stolen in silence. They found drawings on the walls, makeshift beds, a bucket used as a toilet, and the smell of a life never meant to exist underground. The children blinked into the light. They were afraid of open spaces. Their skin was pale, their bodies small, their voices barely a whisper. The basement had become their world, and now it was gone. The nightmare was over, but the damage had only begun to surface. It was late April 2008. The air inside the house was unusually quiet, but in the basement, it was suffocating. Kirsten, the oldest of Elizabeth's underground children, lay motionless on a damp mattress. Her breathing had become shallow. Her body trembled uncontrollably. Her skin had turned pale, nearly translucent. After a lifetime deprived of fresh air, natural light, and medical care, her immune system was collapsing. She had slipped into unconsciousness. There was no medication, no diagnosis, only fear. Elizabeth had watched her daughter deteriorate for days. Every moment stretched into panic. She pleaded with her father, begging him to take Kirsten to a hospital. Josef refused at first. He paced the narrow hallway of the cellar, calculating the risk. For the first time in 24 years, the control he built was beginning to slip. The girl might not survive. Her death would raise questions he could no longer bury. He finally agreed. He carried Kirsten up the stairs into the daylight she had never seen. Her eyes fluttered as her body spasmed in the light. He wrapped her in a blanket and left her at the Amstetten hospital. To the doctors, she was a mystery. A teenage girl with no medical records, severely underweight, underdeveloped. Her kidneys were failing. Her blood pressure was unstable. She was unresponsive. Josef introduced himself as her grandfather. He claimed Kirsten had been dropped off at his home by Elizabeth, who was still living with a secretive religious cult. When pressed for more information, he became defensive. His answers were vague. The doctors, suspicious, alerted local authorities. The police opened a file, and media outlets picked up the story within hours. In a town where secrets had been quiet for decades, Something was finally making noise. Back inside the basement, Elizabeth waited. She knew it was only a matter of time. The sound of footsteps above had changed. They were more frequent, heavier. Josef returned a few days later. His mood was erratic, his confidence shaken. He told Elizabeth she needed to come upstairs and explain everything to the police. He claimed they were suspicious, and the story no longer made sense. She refused unless they could guarantee her safety. The negotiation began inside the same basement where she'd been confined for almost a quarter of a century. On April 26, 2008, Elizabeth stepped out of the cellar for the final time. Her legs were unsteady. Her vision blurred in the daylight. The world outside felt unreal. She was taken to the police station, where officers questioned her for hours. At first, she said little. Then, they promised protection for her children. Slowly, the words began to come, one after another. Truth layered over horror. The details were incomprehensible. Officers struggled to process what they were hearing. She described the door that sealed her inside, the acts of control that took place beyond it, the repeated violations of her freedom, the children born in silence, the one who did not survive, the punishments for speaking too loud, the years without light or warmth or hope, the girl who collapsed in her arms, the boy who had never seen a sky. It was not just a story, it was a confession pulled from the deepest part of human suffering. The next morning, police arrived at the Fritzl house. They followed Josef into the workshop. He pulled aside a shelf. Behind it was a steel-reinforced door, a keypad, another lock, a hallway that led down into the cold dark. When officers stepped inside, the air was damp and still. The fluorescent bulbs buzzed faintly. The walls were lined with children's drawings and stained blankets. The toilet was a bucket. The beds were pieces of foam stacked on the floor. There were low ceilings and narrow passageways. It smelled of metal and mildew. Inside, they found 3 children huddled together. Their eyes were wide. Their bodies were underdeveloped. They were pale, thin. They had no idea what was happening. They had never seen a police officer, never heard a siren, never touched a tree. Their world was 10 steps long and 2 doors deep. They looked around, unsure if they were being rescued or removed. There was no sound, only the soft rustle of blankets and the whisper of feet across the concrete. By evening, the house was surrounded by investigators. Lights flashed across the quiet street. Neighbors stood behind fences, silent and stunned. Journalists gathered as the story began to spread. 1 man, 1 basement. 24 years, 7 children, a town that never knew. Josef Fritzl was arrested. At first, he denied everything. Then, faced with the evidence, he broke. He admitted to the confinement, to the children, to the years of manipulation and control. In court, his eyes were distant. He sat with his hands folded, as if the weight of his secrets had finally been lifted, only to reveal something far heavier underneath. The full horror of the case reached beyond Austria. It became international news, a symbol of silence, of failure, of how evil can thrive in ordinary places when questions are not asked and voices are ignored. Inside that basement, time had stopped. Outside, the world was finally catching up. The cellar was no longer just a space. It was the scene of one of the most devastating human crimes in modern European history. The moment the door opened was the moment the truth could no longer hide. And for the first time in 24 years, Elizabeth and her children could finally breathe. In the months that followed, the house in Amstetten stood silent. Its windows were drawn. Its doors remained closed. Neighbors passed by without speaking. The basement was sealed, but not destroyed. The structure was still there. The walls still remembered. Elizabeth and her children were moved to a quiet village under protection. They were given new names, a new home, but the silence followed them. The children struggled to walk in open spaces. Some screamed at sunlight. Others flinched at the sound of footsteps. Years without the world had rewired their senses. The air outside felt too thin, the sky too wide. Psychologists described their trauma as immeasurable. They would require lifelong care. Their development had stopped and started in unnatural rhythms. They could not name trees or recognize animals. Some had never seen their own reflection. Their drawings were filled with walls, always walls. Elizabeth spoke very little publicly. When she did, her voice was flat, measured. There were things she would never be able to explain. The details of her captivity were not released in full. What happened behind that locked door remained hers, a private ordeal buried under concrete and silence. Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life in a facility for the criminally insane. In 2024, at the age of 88, he applied for parole. He claimed to be old, ill, no longer dangerous. The court denied his request. The weight of what he did had not disappeared with time. The house still stands. No one lives in it now. The basement remains closed. Tourists sometimes stop to look. They take photos from across the street. They do not speak loudly. The place does not invite conversation. It does not answer questions. Inside the cellar, the air is still. The lights are off. The walls remain untouched. A faint smell of old stone lingers. No one goes down there anymore, but it is not forgotten. The silence beneath that home is not just absence. It is memory, heavy and unspoken. No one ever explained how Josef Fritzl installed a multi-room cellar beneath his home without raising a single alarm. Building permits were vague. Inspections were skipped. Walls were poured in silence. His prior conviction for a violent offense was known but never followed. Officials filed away letters that begged for help but asked no questions. The wife who lived above said she heard nothing. The neighbors who passed by saw nothing. The home stood still for 24 years, while a history buried beneath sealed silence continued to grow. And the cellar door remains locked. The code still works.